Hello to everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Zach Schermele, an education reporter at USA Today. Very excited to be having this conversation with some of the smart folks at the Cato Institute about education policy as students and teachers across the country get back to school. It's a very exciting time in federal education policy, very historic, unprecedented. Lots of terms are apt in this moment. This conversation is going to be recorded and uploaded at some point, and there's going to be a Q&A that I'll give you all a little bit more information about how to submit questions for in just a little bit here. But for now, I'd love to just go around the horn and do some introductions. So like I said, I'm Zach Schermele. I work at USA Today. I cover education policy, the U.S. Department of Education, and how federal education policy affects students and faculty across the country, primarily in the higher ed space, but also with respect to K through 12 schools. I will toss it to anyone else who would like to introduce themselves next. Maybe Neal.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for everybody for joining. Thanks, Zach, for stepping up and doing this. I am Neal McCluskey, and I'm the director of the Center for Educational Freedom here at the Cato Institute, which really just means I head up the education department. And the two other people, other than me and Zach, are the major parts of the Center for Educational Freedom. So I'll let them introduce themselves, but just to smooth things along, I'll ask Colleen to go first.
Thanks, Neal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, like Neal said, and to Zach for hosting. And I'm Colleen Hroncich. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Educational Freedom, and I focus mostly on education entrepreneurship, school choice, things like that. So excited for this conversation today.
And I'm Andrew Gillen, and I focus on higher education, primarily federal policy, but also quite a bit of state policy. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, thanks so much to you all for being here today and for being willing to have this chat. Like I said, folks can submit questions via the webpage. There's a Facebook outlet as well, YouTube and X, wherever you are following this conversation. There's likely a mode by which you can submit questions, and we'll have a conversation, and then afterwards move into the Q&A portion. But I kind of just want to jump right in here. I'm hoping to focus on three relatively large buckets here for the purposes of our chat today, and want to start with federal policy. So Congress and the president just passed a really massive piece of legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Some people call it domestic policy bill, a tax and spending bill, OB3. There are a million different terms that are floating around in Washington for what exactly the legislation is. And I had a conversation, I believe it was like 2 weeks ago, with Nick Kent, the newly confirmed Undersecretary of Education, who's largely in charge of implementing some of the greatest provisions in I'm just going to say OB3 for the coming months and is in charge of the negotiated rulemakings that are happening. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what parts of that law will have the most impact on students and why.
Sure, maybe I'll start.
We'll start with Neal, whoever wants to take it.
Yeah. So I'll start and I'll kick it over to Andrew and Colleen because it's got, I think, more big higher ed parts than K through 12, but it's got also a big K through 12 part that I think we need to talk about. I do think it's a huge problem what we call this thing because it's weird to say OBBBB. I think that's one too many B's. I voted for OB cubed, but we'll see if anybody goes along with that. But what I think is, and probably Andrew ought to go first on this because it's got a lot of student loan provisions that I think are important. One that Andrew and I have written about, Andrew more than I have, but the end of Grad Plus, which we think is a big thing. And then maybe after that, Colleen can talk about the scholarship tax credit provision that's in OB cubed. We'll see if OB cubed catches on if we say it enough. And And I think that's a lot of the major parts. So I don't know, Andrew, do you want to go through all the provisions in higher ed, at least the big ones?
Yeah. Well, and it does a little confusing because from the if you're just starting college, you're not going to really notice any difference because undergraduate loans are largely untouched. And it's really only once you get to graduate school or once you start repaying your loans that you start to notice any of the changes that this bill will make. And they did make big changes for a lot of grad students. So as Neal mentioned previously, we had this program called Grad Plus. It was kind of a nightmare program because you could basically the school could charge as much as it wanted, and students would be eligible for that much debt. And this led to over borrowing by students. It led to higher prices, but in the graduate programs, and so killing that program was ultimately a really good move, I think. There were a couple other victories, not quite as big as that. So we've now capped Parent Plus lending, which was a similar program to Grad Plus, only it was for parents instead of students themselves. And then there were various other changes to aggregate and annual loan limits, particularly for graduate students. Those, whether or not those are too high or too low, you can have a debate about. But we've at least moved in the direction of having some stricter limits on graduate lending in particular, where undergraduates in particular will start to see an impact is once they start to repay their loans. So we're going to be phasing out a lot of what were called the income-driven repayment plans, and there were. At last count, I think there were 6 or 7, maybe 8 if you count this Biden program called SAVE that was kind of tied up in courts. We're gonna get rid of almost all of those. There's just gonna be a couple of income-driven repayment plans left, including one that this bill introduces, and it does change a little bit about how student loans are repaid. But that's sort of the main impact for students of this bill. For colleges, I would say the biggest impact is going to be, well, for a segment of colleges, it's going to be the endowment tax. So there were some changes to the taxation of endowment earnings for the endowments that some schools have, and so it'll be interesting to see if that's a stable equilibrium, if that tax gets even higher, if it gets pared back. That's definitely an area to keep watching.
Okay, so moving on to the K-12 part of it, the big piece, of course, as Neal mentioned, is the tax credit scholarship program. And while all of us at Cato, I think, support the concept of tax credit scholarships in general, having the federal government doing it is a much different animal. And I think we're going to probably see some of those challenges as the Treasury Department. So the Education Department isn't really involved in this portion. It's the Treasury Department. And so they're going to be creating rules for it. And that process, I'm sure, is underway quietly right now, not so much publicly, I don't think yet. But there's a lot of vagueness in the bill that's going to lead to a lot of questions. So one of the big provisions in it is that states have to opt in for it. And so how the rules will look for that, some of the conversations that I've had with people is there's of course a bit of a divide on school choice between red states and blue states. The states that are more conservative leaning have tended to adopt school choice, and the states that are not, that are more Democrat leaning, have tended to shy away from that. And so one of the original, I think, impetus of doing a federal program was to give people in those states access to this. Since states have to opt in, there was a big question mark on how many blue states will do that. However, public schools also appear to be eligible for the program. So that's going to probably make the calculation a little bit trickier for blue state governors. And I think the Treasury Department rules maybe will give us some clarity on whether a state could opt in solely for public schools or whether whether it would have to include private schools. So there's a lot of questions like that, what exactly it means to opt in, how narrowly can a state define these scholarship organizations. And I think all of these types of rules kind of point back to the trickiness of having the federal government involved, because the Fed setting policy for 50 states is going to cause problems because different states have different populations with different needs and interests, and it's going to be a complicated process, I think. And I hope that the people that push this don't regret it if the rules tend to be very burdensome, and if either it makes schools not able to participate, or else they participate but then come to regret it eventually. So hopefully that won't happen. It's going to be a lot of people are going to have to really keep their eye on what's happening at the Treasury Department and what the rulemaking process brings forward, and then of course how states respond to that.
I think that's a really interesting point, Colleen, and it goes to some of the larger questions that the administration is grappling with right now, certainly in the wake of the passage of OB cubed, I think is what Neal called it. I mean, is there a way that you feel like the administration could have gone about it that wasn't so burdensome for the federal government, didn't involve so many rulemakings, like, you know, some sort of block grant or discretionary grant process that you would have liked to have seen instead?
Well, it's kind of the nature of the beast. When the federal government does something, there's going to be rules and bureaucracies attached to it. I think they did it in a way that they were trying to streamline it as much as possible. I think the drafters of it really wanted it to be clean. I don't think they want a lot of rules and regulations about it, but it's just part of the process. It's going to happen. And the big question is who is drafting the rules, who's got, you know, who's able to weigh in on that, how involved the public gets, and just trying to make it, from my perspective, as unregulated as possible. I think that, you know, from my personal opinion is that's better, but also I think there's a lot of evidence saying that less regulation on these programs are better because that encourages participation from schools, from providers, from teachers. So that's what I hope happens, but it's always sticky when you get the feds involved.
What are your thoughts, Neal? Are there a couple of pieces of it that stand out to you?
You mean of OB cubed?
Yeah, of
If it's about,
whatever
yeah,
we're calling it in this segment.
right. I'm going with OB cubed because I think I came up with it. So let's do that. But I think those are the big ones. I think definitely that higher ed was a much bigger part of this, and that's largely because you know, a lot of people, when we talk about education policy generally, and if we talk about the federal government or the Department of Education, they tend to think of K through 12 first. But it's important to remember that actually a much bigger thing that the Department of Education and the federal government does is work in higher ed, in particular student aid, so all the student loan programs, but also Pell Grants and work study. So it's not really surprising that the higher ed parts kind of dominate in education because that's where the federal government is most involved, even though I think people tend to think and to talk more about the K through 12 stuff.
Yeah, and you mentioned Pell Grants, Neal, which is something that I wanted to get at least someone's read on as well, because there was a piece of legislation that, you know, we've been talking about in the federal education policy space for a long time that, you know, experts that I've engaged with have sort of they're like, I can't believe it's something that, you know, it's been floating around in our brains for so long. It's actually something that is established policy now, but that's workforce Pell or short-term Pell programs. And, you know, there were criticisms of that particular piece of the legislation from consumer protection advocates in the early stages, but, you know, dating back to the beginnings of that debate over whether or not Pell Grants should be expanded to include some pretty short-term programs. And those were largely, I think, addressed. I think it would depend on the particular folks on the other side of the debate that you're asking. But you know, there were some guardrails that were included in the legislation to ensure that schools and programs aren't necessarily taking advantage to a significant degree of that money. Are there anybody on the panel have any thoughts about that program and what it could look like going forward, and whether states are ready. There was a great story in Inside Higher Ed today about asking the question of whether states are ready to move forward with workforce Pell.
Yeah, so workforce Pell is one of those things that like everybody is like on board with it at that level of detail, and then once you say, okay, but who are the eligible providers, like who can actually get receive this money, and that's where the disagreement tends to come in. I would say it's too early to say. So there's two concerns. One is that you just have this open federal spigot, open to anybody and everybody. It's going to be picked over by scam artists, and it's going to be a terrible thing. The other problem, you can go too far that way. You can go too far the other way, which is that you make it so restrictive that it's not worth it for anybody to provide these programs, these educational opportunities. And so trying to thread the needle there of, okay, who can actually provide these things. Now, the way they did that, they said you have to be basically an existing school. So basically, if you're already eligible for Title IV, you can offer these programs. It has to be for an existing program. So this program has to already have existed for a year. And then there's some, I think, earnings and job placement requirements. Like you have to have, I think it's like 70% of the students need to be in high demand fields, and 70% of them need to work in those fields after graduation. And those are all, individually, I think there's a good case for each of those. I think when you stack them all together, I think we're pretty close to the we've made this so restrictive that we aren't going to see any changes.
I see. That's an interesting perspective, and I think gets into a point that I know Neal wanted us to touch on in this conversation, which is a larger question about the so-called College for All movement, and how Democrats in particular, over the course of definitely the last decade plus, have sort of shifted their ideology with respect to how they talk about workforce development programs. And, I've always said that there are strange bedfellows in Washington with respect to higher education policy. And I think OBQ is a good indication of that right now. But the question that I know we wanted to make sure we got some discussion about conversation is, what the College for All movement, whether or not there's sort of a final death knell into that idea as a result of some of the federal policy shifts, and whether or not we need to be having larger conversations starting at the K-12 level about the types of post-secondary opportunities that are available to folks after they graduate from high school.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that. It's from I think a question that we got from somebody who really wanted to make sure that we kind of tackle this idea or concern, I think, that we essentially have set up a system of education that pushes everybody to a 4-year degree, or increasingly a requirement to get graduate degrees, and it really starts at the beginning. And I think there's a lot to be said that we do that, although not as much as we used to do. So when we had the No Child Left Behind Act, which is really just the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which started in the 60s, but gets reauthorized and gets a new name. But the No Child Left Behind Act, the federal government really started to tell states, hey, this is what your education system needs to look like. It needs to look like everybody reaches proficiency by the year 2014. And we say it's college and career readiness that we're focused on, but it's really college readiness, because everybody should be aiming to go to college. And so for a long time, we had a K through 12 system that all the impetus, because the federal government would sort of punish you if you didn't hit this, was to get as many students as you could to college. And it didn't really matter so much whether they wanted to go to college, what they were going to study in college. It was, this is the end that you should be aiming for. And I think that the concern is, well, college is an end to education, but it shouldn't be the end. For some people, they won't want to do something that requires a 4-year degree with a liberal arts core. They might want to do something like become an electrician or a plumber or a career in technical education. And we were pushing, I think, through law, but also I think through the culture, kind of an ethos of if you don't go to college, you've fallen short. Um, this idea pushing everybody, the system all geared to go into college and increasingly a graduate degree, because as more and more people get a 4-year degree, you need something even higher to signal something that you're different. And that meant a higher degree. I think the good news is that we kind of moved away from that. So No Child Left Behind fell out of favor because of it. It was very restrictive. It was very prescriptive. It was the federal government telling people what to do. Eventually, they wrapped something called the Common Core into that, which was the federal government essentially telling you what your curriculum had to be bounded by. And we rejected it. And so part of what we've seen, and that was in 2015, was federal government is less involved, less dictatorial. And we've seen, I think, a change in this idea that, well, you are somehow less than if you pursue a career that doesn't require a college degree. I think we've increasingly come to appreciate that there are lots of skills that are highly valuable that don't require that you go to college. And that's really a change in the culture. So I think we have had a system that pushed everybody to college, but we've changed that. And then Colleen, I'm sure, could talk more about this, is a major piece of this is we've also reduced the one path that everybody had in K-12, where you'd be assigned to a public school, and that is where you'd be educated. And yes, you might have the ability to go to career and technical education, but that was often frowned upon and sometimes seen as forced tracking. And now we have a lot more school choice and an assumption that parents should be deciding with their kids, what is the best educational path, not what is dictated by government.
Right, and I think that really kind of points to the problem with the monopoly in general is it's basically one ship steering everybody in essentially the same direction. And as homeschooling has grown more popular, because homeschoolers have recognized this for a long time, a lot of homeschoolers take very diverse paths towards their future. But with the school choice programs that a lot of states have enacted, and a lot of them are very student focused, an education savings account that lets people use the funds at a wide variety of educational purchases. And so with those, parents are really able to craft new learning paths for their kids. And oftentimes that does include the trades and entrepreneurial endeavors. And there's a lot of micro schools now that have really exciting focuses on various, whether it's building or electricity or the arts, and it's opening up new opportunities for a lot of kids in the K through 12 range, which will set them up in an ability to look beyond college for their future too.
I think that. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, just to add one thing here. So I think the college for all message was wrong. I think the college for none message is wrong. But then the question is, okay, well, how do you decide, where we land? To me, I mostly look at credential inflation. So like if you start seeing a lot of jobs requiring a college degree that don't actually need the skill set that you would acquire in college, then that to me is an indication that probably too many people are going. So there was a good example that's I think it was 2 years ago or so. Preston Cooper is a scholar at American Enterprise Institute. He found the job application for the driver of the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile, which is like a mascot of this like food hot dog brand. You needed a bachelor's degree for that job. That job does not require college level skills, but they were basically using the college degree as a screening device, which is telling you that the market's kind of oversaturated with that particular credential in that particular area. And so to me, I think college for all was wrong. I'm not comfortable going with college for none, and so I just look at credential inflation to see if we're sending too few or too many.
Yeah, I would just add that. Oh, sorry, I'll throw one more thing in. It can't be a top-down decision. So when we tell the federal government tells everybody, well, this is what your aim is, that doesn't make sense because all people are different. And so what's really important here is that it's bottom up decisions, not top down. So I don't want the federal government, I don't even want state governments, I don't want school districts saying, well, the right thing for everybody is to go to college or not go to college. It has to be driven by each individual student.
And, I'm reminded of some of the last conversations that I had with Secretary Miguel Cardona during the Biden administration. I mean, he graduated from vocational high school, I believe it was, that I think focused on car manufacturing, something to that effect. And so, he was very adamant about the importance of CTE and of changing that mindset. And I think that's a really valuable and insightful way to sort of frame this debate, Andrew, not necessarily so much as college for all versus college for none, but a matter of credential inflation. And whenever we can try and frame this debate in a way that allows us to think about workforce development and the needs of the economy, right? And how the education system is, in an equitable way, preparing workers for the opportunity to meet the needs of the economy and of society. I think that is the right way to go, because, on one end of the equation, you don't want folks applying for jobs with a degree with a lot of debt, I think is the crux of that, right? With a lot of debt that they potentially might not be able to pay back if they're not seeing any form of a return on investment on that degree. And at the other end of the debate, our society and our workforce does need graduate school and does need doctors and lawyers and researchers in order to solve the questions and the most pressing issues of our time. So I think it's important to acknowledge both sides of that equation. Just to stick a pin in this conversation about the reconciliation law that passed, I mentioned at the top of this, and Colleen and I were discussing, regulations and how every time there's a big change at the federal level, especially, there can be a significant amount of regulations that follow. What are your thoughts about whether or not the education department has the ability to effectively implement some of those pretty big lifts? I mean, there is a so-called do no harm threshold, is I believe what congressional Republicans were calling it, but it's basically an accountability metric for colleges and universities, trying to ensure that folks who graduate are making at least the same, if not more, as this similar high school graduate in their state who didn't go to college. And it's a lot of data to be able to effectively implement. And, I remember a recent time where law was passed, the FAFSA Act, and wasn't necessarily adequately implemented to the degree that would have reduced harm for families that experienced it. And I think that there was a question of priorities at the department at the time of the implementation of that legislation, and a question of capacity in the Federal Student Aid Office. And so folks that I talked to who are critical of the workforce reductions at the Department of Education are nervous that, we could be in a similar boat with more pressing and potentially problematic consequences for students if we're not aware of capacity at the department. I don't know if any of you have questions or thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I'll go ahead. I don't know whether you've got anything on, the specifics of the higher ed stuff and the accountability mechanisms. I think that obviously a lot of this concern is that the department, The administration has lots of things they have to implement, and they cut the workforce at the Department of Education by around half. There have been some people returned, so it actually hasn't been a half from previous staffing. It was around 4,100, 4,200 before these cuts. It was, I think, around 2,300, probably where it is now. And, will they be able to do these things? And I think one of the things that we're going to learn is, well, was the department overstaffed? And I don't think we know. There's always been an assumption that, oh, well, whatever they have to do, they need more people. And there had been some concern about, well, will they be able to process the FAFSA? And of course, Zach, as you said, there was a lot of problems with simplifying that under the Biden administration. There were a lot of delays. At least what the administration is saying now is they're on target to have their latest iteration of FAFSA ready to go by October, which is on time. So we'll see whether or not they can do it. I would just sort of caution that we shouldn't assume because they have cuts, they're not going to be able to do these things. But, the proof will be in the pudding, and we just don't know yet, how well they're going to handle these.
Well, and so much of the work is outsourced. So I was reading an article the other day about a new data requirement for admissions data that would be within the IPEDS, which is one of the existing data collection efforts in higher education. And one of the critiques of this new policy was that, well, the department just fired all 6 people at the department who were responsible for IPEDS. Which, okay, fair, but there were only 6 people responsible. Like, this is the biggest data set in federal higher ed. And so who was actually doing that work? Well, it turns out that we're mostly contracting that out to a group called RTI. And so to the extent that RTI still has that contract and gets a new contract to compile this new admissions data, that'll be where the rubber meets the road, much more so than the 6 people at the department.
Yeah, if there's something that I have learned a lot with respect to data gathering and other forms of activities that the education department is engaged in, it's that arguably one of the most critical functions of the agency is vendor management and working with contractors. And ironically, I think that folks on the left and on the right would find agreement in taking sort of an abundance kind of a mindset to vendor management at the department. I think that, James Quall, who was the previous undersecretary of education, the top higher ed official in the country during the Biden years, and was largely in charge of the new FAFSA rollout, was very critical of the roadblocks that were in his and others' way as they tried to simplify the FAFSA because of just the way that the federal contracting process works out. So I'm kind of surprised we haven't heard a little bit more about that going forward. And actually, the Government Accountability Office is going to come out at some point soon here with a report relating to the contractor that was largely in charge of overseeing FAFSA simplification. So maybe that'll jumpstart that conversation. Just sticking with the education department here too. It's my understanding that congressional Republicans are going to potentially try and move forward now with moving some pieces of legislation that aren't necessarily one large bill that could dismantle the education department, because they know that they don't have the support from Senate Democrats to do that, but could implement some or try to seek to codify some new agreements between agencies, right? So similar to the adult education, OCTE is the name of the office, and Labor Department agreement that the Education Department has moved forward with recently after the Supreme Court gave them the green light to do that. Wondering if any of you have thoughts on that strategy politically, kind of what the feasibility of it is, and whether or not it could gain any form of democratic support. Potentially the argument is that the education department is understaffed and needs to move some pieces of its work to other agencies. That's a line of reasoning that could maybe find some reception among Democrats. But curious your thoughts on that front.
Yeah, so I'll take that. I think that it is true that they don't have enough support that they could get a majority or especially a supermajority to vote to eliminate the Department of Education. There are some bills about that. I just did a count recently. I think there are about 7 of them. And so I expect there'll be some discussion of that in Congress, but probably, as you said, more likely will be kind of more piecemeal moving things or slowly kind of pushing responsibilities to other departments. And I think some of it makes sense. So when you talk about workforce development programs, it makes sense that those would be the Department of Labor and the Department of Education. And from what I can tell, it looks like the Department of Education will still have primary oversight, but the Department of Labor will be doing a lot of the legwork because it's the Department of Labor that works more with workforce. So it's not about just pushing student aid to somebody. It's not about supplementary funding for K through 12. It's about workforce development. So I think we'll probably see more of that, and I think that makes some sense. In the first Trump administration, it was actually a proposal to essentially merge the Department of Education and the Department of Labor. So it's consistent with that. It didn't move very far, but it was something that came from the Trump administration. And I think that there's a very good argument that all student aid, especially student loan programs, should go to the Department of Treasury, where at the very least it is staffed with people who are from a financial background. So as I mentioned earlier, people think of the Department of Education and they usually think of K through 12 education. Usually the person who is the Secretary of Education is somebody who has primarily a K through 12 background. And it's never been somebody who has been from a bank or some sort of other lending institution. And it makes sense that Treasury handles student loans. And so I could see something like that getting a fair amount of support in Congress. I don't know whether it would be a majority, but because it is rational to do that, I can see, not that Congress always does what's rational, often they do the opposite, but in an ideal world, they would do the rational thing. And I think moving to student loans to Treasury would make a lot of sense.
There's also been some discussion to Secretary McMahon. I remember being at her confirmation hearing, and she explicitly noted the prospect of potentially making it so that the Health and Human Services Department could have oversight of IDEA and funding for students with disabilities, which could have implications for K-12 schools. Have you heard anything about that, Colleen? And do you think that that is a likelihood at any point?
My understanding is that's where those were eventually when they were first created. They were created more than a decade before the Department of Education was. So it does seem, as Neal mentioned with the labor, it does seem like a pretty good fit when you're talking about students with disabilities and special needs, having them be in a department that deals more with the health issues. So, but I stay outside of the Beltway, so I haven't heard rumors to that effect so much. But it's definitely something that's been talked about. How far along those talks are, I couldn't say.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll have to see. It's very much a question too of the degree to which Republicans on the Hill have much of an ability to find some receptive Democrats that could be willing to move that forward for them. So, we'll see. The next piece that I wanted to just shift to as well is the fact that, we are at a pretty significant point in education policy history, because we have seen more and more parents in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic become a lot more alacritous to send their students to non-public schools. And more states are deciding to opt into school choice provisions. I know the Education Department recently issued a Dear Colleague letter to state and local educational agencies offering what they called additional guidance on how they might be able to provide equitable services for students enrolled in private schools in more efficient and effective ways. What are your thoughts, Colleen, on how the Education Department is going about trying to support some of that momentum that's in certain states with respect to school choice? I should note it's not all states, right? There were a couple of ballot initiatives and referenda that were not approved last year. I can't remember exactly when, but it's not moving full speed ahead across the country per se in the same way. But there are certain states that have become a lot more willing and receptive to school choice programs.
Right. Well, I think in the Trump administration, there's definitely the belief that putting power in the hands of parents is better than power in the hands of bureaucrats. And so that's the impetus probably behind the Dear Colleague letters that they've been putting out. And those are just aimed at making sure states or districts understand the authorities that they already have under these rules and making sure that they are doing the most that they can do in order to support private school students in the way that the laws indicate that they're supposed to, which from what I've heard from private school leaders, sometimes districts don't always want to play nicely with them. But I think once again, this gets us back to, should the federal government be that involved in this when there's going to be contentions around it, and the nation is very diverse, of course. And that's why I think it's exciting that so many states have really moved the needle on educational freedom in general, from school choice programs that are the voucher type, where it's opening the doors for kids to attend private schools. But then even more exciting is education savings accounts that allow kids to follow all sorts of learning paths and really and for kids with special needs, which a lot of those federal programs are aimed at, these education savings accounts are phenomenal because it's essentially, in a public school, they get something called an individualized education plan. But an education savings account gives each family the ability to create their own education plan for their kids and make sure that they're getting the services that work best for their kids, rather than having to deal with the bureaucracy of the public school system, which, if you ever talk to a parent of kids with special needs, it's oftentimes a nightmare for them. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it pits parents against districts trying to do what the parents feel their kids need. So I think that, while it's great that the Trump administration is trying to personalize things and give parents power, really getting it out of the federal government is the best way to achieve that. And that's why I think when we're seeing so many states move forward with these programs, that's really exciting and will really open up opportunities for kids.
Yeah, I'm jumping a little early to a question that we have here in the Q&A just because it's apt, but we have Adam who's asking which states are most likely to approve or significantly expand school choice in 2026 is the year that he is asking. I'm wondering if there are any states that are on your radar, Colleen, or others.
Well, there's certainly some of the red states that haven't jumped in yet, and so there's the possibility. North Dakota had where they passed one, but then the governor vetoed it, saying that it didn't go quite far enough, and so maybe they'll figure out a way to get that one across. Other states that have toyed with it, when we had a ton of progress this year, so that's certainly gotten some of the low-hanging fruit. It has already been dealt with. Ohio and Indiana, North Carolina, they all have universal vouchers, which are great. But moving towards an education savings account would be a big improvement for the families in those states, because then the kids would have options beyond, just a private school where they'd have more of that individualized learning ability. So I think that that's something that people in those states are probably looking for. Other states have pretty good programs, but like in Louisiana, they have the LA Gator program, which has universal eligibility for applying, but their budget isn't there to allow it. So they had to turn away a lot of applicants this year because the legislature and the governor couldn't agree on a budget that was big enough to cover all the students that were applying for it. So I think that's where a lot of work will be done in the next year, is taking programs that exist and making them better, whether it's through increasing the funding or increasing the flexibility of their usage. And then the states that big, like Texas was a big one this year that passed a $1 billion plan, universal eligibility. So just seeing them get up and running will be something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, certainly. We're going to try and move to the Q&A in like 5 minutes here, but just wanted to make sure that I especially got to the K-12 part of this conversation, because I have a tendency to largely focus on higher ed, blame my chronicle of higher education training on that. But, as this conversation is going on, Colleen, about school choice, we're seeing, I was talking to a lot of school district administrators at public schools over the summer who were very concerned about the degree to which their grants or other things that they were reliant on with respect to federal funding was causing uncertainty in their ability to budget. And, our understanding now, according to comments that Russ Vought, the head of the White House Office of Management and Budget, made relatively recently, is that the next round of rescissions that the White House is going to try and push through is probably related to education department grants. And, I'm not entirely certain what types of funding are going to be included in that. But I think the bottom line here is that it's a really tough time to be a school district administrator and that's in any way very reliant on federal funding. School districts didn't get their Title I allocations until I think it was like a month after they usually do this year. It's not clear why that was the case, but things are delayed, and it's hard to budget, which school districts are very often operating in a way that's trying to squeeze as much value out of every penny that they have, including the very small amount of money that public school districts get from the federal government. Relatively, it's about a tenth in most cases of their annual budget. But what is the advice of you and anyone else on this panel to school district administrators that are trying to navigate that kind of uncertainty?
Not to sound like a broken record, but I do think this points again to the problem with having much reliance on the federal government, because then you're stuck with the political whims that happen there. But beyond the question of federal funding, school districts are just going to have to really think hard about how they do things. With more and more students having access to educational choice, there's people that are opting out of the local school system, and that does oftentimes affect the school's funding. And there have been a lot of stories recently about school districts that are having to close schools or lay off teachers, do reorganizations, and sometimes the tone of those is sort of this shouldn't be happening, but to think this shouldn't be happening means that you think the kids should have to stay in a school that's not working for them just to ensure that that school stays open. And I don't think anybody really would support that notion. You see, like in a state like Florida, where they have really widespread educational choice, both in the private and public sectors, last school year, more than half, just over half of kids in the state went to a school other than their assigned school. And so this is really the wave of the future. And I think school district leaders need to recognize that as the federal program gets underway. That may, states that currently were a little bit safe from that, maybe they no longer will be if their governors opt into the program. But they're going to have to just realize that it's happening and they should embrace it. And by embrace it, I mean, make sure you're offering the best product possible. And a lot of times that's going to be much more personalized and flexible for families, for teachers, and maybe partnerships with local private schools, being open to transfers, open enrollment type stuff. Some schools can opt into accepting ESAs in different states, doing a la carte classes for homeschoolers. There's challenges, but with challenges come a lot of opportunities. And the school districts that recognize those opportunities and embrace the opportunity to really rise up and offer something wonderful are the school districts that are going to thrive in this new environment. And that's ultimately going to benefit kids, families, teachers, and communities, because when the educational options in a community are better, that's better for the whole community.
If I can, I just want to add a few things to this to sort of put it into important context. So, Zach, it's an important point you made that only about a tenth of funding for K through 12 education comes from the federal government. It varies a bit based on district to district and what year you're in. So over the last 40 years, the average has been about, federal government's provided about 8.5%. And this is important to understand because, one, at that low a level, school districts should never feel like they are dependent on federal money because they know it's small. And more importantly, it shouldn't really be there at all. And the reason it is small is because the Constitution doesn't give the federal government any authority to be involved in K through 12 education. So it's a small contributor because it's really working on the margins, because legally it really shouldn't be involved at all. And I want to just sort of make it clear that we always tend to hear that school districts are cutting to the bone or that they're facing some sort of financial Armageddon. But if you look at per pupil spending for the last, almost a century, but 40 or 50 years, it's been an almost unremitting climb in the amount spent. In just the last 5 years that the federal government has data for, we've seen almost a 9% increase in real funding per pupil. So it's just not the case that public schools are constantly scrounging for money. It keeps increasing. And the last thing it's important that we remember is a lot of what school districts are saying is, well, we're going to hit a fiscal cliff. That cliff is because of something called ESSER. Basically, it was COVID relief money. And it was said from the beginning, and it was supposed to be clear, that that was a one-time shot of money. So no school district should be saying, well, we were depending on continually getting that amount of money from the federal government, because from the get-go, we were told that is a one-time infusion of funds to deal with COVID. So I'm certainly sympathetic to administrators who, like everybody, get budgets and they have limited resources and they have to live within them. But I sometimes feel like school districts, or the portrayal of what they're facing, overstates the straits that they're in, because we actually have for a very long time consistently put in a lot of money to K through 12 education, and I don't think it gets acknowledged enough.
Just for a little more context on what a lot of money means, just for, I think a lot of people are shocked by this number, but the most recent figure on the national average was more than $18,000 per student, and that was the 2021-22 school year. So people in polling often will guess $5,000, $7,000, maybe $10,000 per student, but it's actually over 18,000. And it's surely higher by now.
Yeah, and I think the other the piece of this that is important to keep in mind too is that school districts have to be able to make decisions based off of relatively reliable estimates of time and precedent and notice that's being given to them by all the stakeholders involved in their budgeting process. And that is not in every case happening at this particular moment in time. Grants are being cut and programs are being rescinded without necessarily any sort of notice to stakeholders that is at least consistent with what has happened in the past. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are reasonable debates that can be had about the federal role in schools, but also schools want to make sure that they can work with the education department, with the federal government more broadly, and that they can rely on the information that's coming out of the agency, and that they can negotiate about things in good faith, and that they have partners at the federal level who want them to be successful. And that's just a matter of bandwidth in some respects, but also just implementation of some of these policies, regardless of where they're coming from on the ideological spectrum. Okay, we only have like 5 minutes left. I'm sorry, this conversation has really been great and informative, so I'm going to try and see if we can't get to a couple of the questions in the Q&A. There is a question about statistical operation here from Melissa. She says that the destruction of the education department's statistical operation is a problem. How can we do without the international comparisons those data supply? So sort of touches on something that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, and I think is certainly relevant to the discussion about the education department's reliance on vendors and contractors. But Linda McMahon says that the NAEP test is on track. We will see, like Neal said. But I'm wondering if anyone here, maybe in response to that question, has any thoughts about like progress reports or anything that the education department can do to ensure all the stakeholders involved that it's doing its level best to put together data that schools can use.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's ever been particularly good at putting together data schools use. So you have, for instance, the What Works Clearinghouse, and it turns out very rarely do educators use it. We are going to continue the NAEP, as I understand it, like you said, at least, and also what Linda McMahon said, although I think it may be pared down. So we may not see all the exams we usually see, but the math and the reading, and I guess the science would remain. But I think it's important to note that even before the cuts made by Trump, the data that we get from the Department of Education isn't always often all that useful. So I looked at the Digest of Education Statistics today, and I often use the revenue and expenditure data often to look at, well, what are we spending per pupil? And it actually hasn't been updated since the 2020-2021 school year. Now, you can say part of that is because Trump cut the staff, but before that, you would think they'd be only a year or two behind, but we're now heading into 2025, 2026. So there's a question of, yes, they collect data, but how useful is it? And I think for a long time, it's been very slow and not all that useful. In terms of the international exams, I'd have to look because I haven't checked in a while. It wouldn't surprise me if we continued to participate in TIMSS and PEARLS and PISA, but maybe a lot of the other NAEP tests that we've seen that people don't always pay a whole lot of attention to may not be fielded, and maybe they'll do some other NAEP less often.
I'm not sure if you have any thoughts too, Andrew, on just data collection, and if there's something that, I guess, you mentioned IPEDS, which is the primary higher education database. And President Trump issued a memorandum. It was not an executive order that directed the education secretary to essentially overhaul IPEDS and make it easier to use. Do you have any thoughts about the likelihood of the success of that effort, and what that could look like and whether it's needed? Have you felt like when you're using those data that database needs to be improved?
That database clearly needs to be improved. I've played small parts in various efforts to make that data more usable to non-data experts. There was an old project called the Delta Cost Project. There was a new project at the Urban Institute. Like, everybody's always trying to make that data more useful, and there's a reason, because the way it's set up, it's fundamentally not very usable. So for me, that's great. It's job security. But whether they succeed in simplifying that, I have no idea. My guess is that would be a multi-year effort, in the best of circumstances. And I know they're trying to do a lot of other things too. So I think that's probably going to be more of a back burner issue, which just kind of leaves us with a status quo in terms of how usable it is for the next few years, at least.
Right. Again, a question of implementation, and everyone wants that effort to be successful. And I've seen so many folks who were pointing to that executive order. There were other more controversial, or memorandum, I should say, not that there's that much of a difference, but we're pointing at that piece, that directive from the president, and saying we want more transparency with respect to data that colleges have to submit. We want the databases that we have to rely on as education researchers and people who work at colleges to be easier to use. But we also don't want this to crash and burn. And so I think that it's going to be a question, like many of these things, of hoping that the education department keeps stakeholders informed, and that schools, if they're having problems, make their voices heard. But so we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions in the Q&A. Appreciate everybody who sent those in. They were very illuminating. Appreciate all of you for making the time to enjoy this conversation, and I'm glad that, if nothing else, we settled on a term for OB cubed. I'll see if that sticks. I'll have a conversation with our editor-in-chief and our copy editors and see if they're content with using that in our stories going forward. But appreciate this meeting of education nerds. It's usually where I like to spend most of my days. So, and a recording of this event will be available online. So thanks again, all.